Welcome to the 2017 Paul and Irene Hollister Endowed Lecture on Glass. Paul Hollister was a noted art historian, glass collector, writer, editor, artist, critic, and teacher, whose articles and reviews appeared widely in publications such as the New York Times, the magazine Antiques, American Craft, and the Journal of Glass Studies of the Corning Museum of Glass. And he taught courses on the history of glass and glassmaking here at the Bard Graduate Center in our early days. Paul was born in New York in 1918 and died in 2004. His papers, recorded lectures, and interviews are now in the archives of American art at the Smithsonian Institution and the Corning Museum of Glass. Much of his vast library is here at the Bard Graduate Center. This lecture series was founded in honor of his wife, Irene, who was a noted scholar, collector, and patron in her own right. It is fitting that one of our graduates will be giving the Hollister lecture tonight. This is Susie Silbert, who was appointed Curator of Modern and Contemporary Glass at the Corning Museum of Glass in 2016. Prior to joining the museum, she was an independent curator as well as a lecturer on the history of glass at the Rhode Island School of Design. Her recent exhibitions include the nearly unpronounceable #funked! Exploring the relationship between digital interfaces and handmade objects, Concept Process at Parsons New School for Design, Material Location at Urban Glass, and Sprawl, an interdisciplinary exhibition interpreting urban development at the Houston Center for Contemporary Craft. Her writing has appeared in exhibition catalogs for the Chrysler Museum, Houston Center for Contemporary Craft, Urban Glass, and the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston, as well as in American Art Collector, Glass Quarterly, Metalsmith, and on the American Craft Council website. She contributed to the forthcoming book, Cast, on casting in all media. She holds an MA in Decorative Arts, Design History, and Material Culture from the Bard Graduate Center. Susie will speak to us tonight on Blue Chip Artists, Glassy Thinkers, and Boro Boys, Navigating Contemporary Glass. Please join me in welcoming Susie Silbert.
Thank you guys so much for being here, and thank you to the BGC for having me here. It feels really great to be back and to be up at the podium for a change. So, Blue Chip Artists, Glassy Thinkers, and Boro Boys, Navigating the Contemporary Glass Landscape. When I was asked to give this talk, which was about a year ago, and pretty much the moment that I started the job at Corning, I was thinking, well, what exactly do I have to talk about? I don't have any big projects for the new job yet. I don't have any big plans I can talk about, but I thought I am asked quite a bit about what the future of glass will be, and even more so now as a result of my position and maybe my relative youth. As if youth and my perch in the ivory tower, which incidentally in my case is white, allow me some kind of extended oracular vision. Unfortunately for them, and perhaps for you if that's what you thought you were coming for, I am no oracle. But I understand the questioner's concern and their desire for some kind of word from beyond that everything is going to be okay. They're anxious because contemporary glass is in the midst of a generational shift. Many of the first studio glass artists and collectors are aging out. Habitat and Heller Galleries, the first in the country devoted specifically to glass, have reevaluated their strategies in recent years and have put new people in charge of their artistic programs. Perfect timing. In Habitat's case, they have literally passed the torch to the next generation. The founder's sons now run the business. If that all doesn't hit home, perhaps this will. The studio glass movement was popularly inaugurated in 1962 with Harvey Littleton's Toledo Glass Workshops. That means the movement is now in its 55th year, approaching eligibility for early retirement. And like anyone facing their golden years, folks invested in studio glass want to make sure their hard work will pay off, live on after them, that their inheritors will be well provided for. And since there are no investment advisors for the health of artistic movements, it's the curators, writers, and archivists that get the panicky calls. So, even though I can't foretell the future, I can say that what I see from my vantage point in Corning makes me hopeful for the future. The next generation might not be fully formed yet. There's still a lot of nurturing to do. And it will likely not look like anything we know now, but it is developing along strong lines. I see phenomenal openings in the way artists think, use, and make glass objects. Today, I will share with you a few of the trends I see influencing the development of the field. 1, blue chip artists. For years, artists, dealers, and especially collectors operating under the umbrella of the Art Alliance for Contemporary Glass and their regional groups pushed for glass to be accepted as an artist's material, for it to be actively accessioned by museums, collected with seriousness, treated by scholars. All of this to great effect. Most major museums and several smaller ones have works by Studio Glass's greatest hits, Dale Chihuly and William Morris, Tom Petty and Harvey Littleton, and Lino Tagliapietra, amongst others. There are shelves in libraries, the NK 5106s, to be exact, and specialized commercial galleries that have done quite well with the material. And of course, I would not be here today if it wasn't for the unflagging support of this material by glass aficionados and their advocacy on its behalf. However, one pitfall of this approach was advocating for glass to be accepted as art rather than on its own merits, and this push to be accepted as art was often without reference or knowledge of the products of the art world itself. It was a case of outsiders pushing in, of trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. As a result, it's no surprise that some of these efforts fell flat, and that, as they did, many glass aficionados felt like they were second-class citizens, like the objects they knew and loved were not good enough for the mainstream. But who can blame the contemporary art world? The glass advocates were speaking a different language, one bound up in technical proficiency and decorative arts-aligned forms such as the vessel, and the contemporary art world was hard-pressed to understand. Perhaps, if there was a fault, it was one of failed communication rather than lack of appreciation. Today, the situation on the ground is quite different. Glass is clearly accepted as an artist material. Artists as diverse as Fred Wilson, so 2 new pieces we have, Kiki Smith, and Olafur Eliasson, which we do not have, deploy the material with a sensitivity to the meanings that can be evoked through glass's phenomenology and the historical associations of the glass objects in the history of decorative arts. Of course, it's important to mention that contemporary artists using glass is not a new phenomenon. In addition to Larry Bell and Christopher Wilmarth, who have long been referenced for their connections to studio glass, artists like Monir Farman-Farmayan, who has a show up right now at the Chrysler Museum in Virginia and had a retrospective at the Guggenheim that you may have seen in the last couple of years, whose tessellated glass mosaics masterfully combine Persian sensibilities with Western aesthetics, have been working in glass for decades. To achieve these large-scale works, most, if not all of these artists, employ skilled artisans to carry out their ideas. And today, much of this work is carried out, for instance, at Adriano Barengo's studio in Murano. His most recent iteration of glass dress, which includes work by artists with and without glass backgrounds, is just opening now. There's a difference, however, between hiring hands to use a material because it is the best vehicle for the idea, and developing concepts in glass by working the material oneself. If I could venture a guess, I would bet that it was the latter usage that glass collectors and others were hoping to achieve. And so if I could go back in time and rewrite their rallying cry, if I could try to interject and alleviate some of the miscommunication, I would clarify their vision. Instead of making glass a suitable material for art, I would propose making glass a suitable material for artists to manipulate. It's the relationship to the hand that was truly at stake. In the rest of my lecture, I'm going to highlight 2 very different areas of contemporary glass production, which, along with blue chip artists, are shaping the landscape of contemporary glass in profound ways. These 2 areas, which feature very different relationships to skill and technique, are the Glassy Thinkers and the Boro boys. So, over the last several years, I've noticed many emerging artists focusing on the methods and methodologies of glassmaking as a means for art making. Artists like Stephanie Pender, Brett Swenson, Anna Riley, Johanna Janka, and Corinna Mullings use the processes of creating and firing glass batch as the primary vehicle for making meaning in their work. The products of their research are often dematerialized. While they occasionally produce objects, more often their output takes the form of installations, concepts, videos, and in the case of Brett Swenson, of piles of dirt on the floor. In other words, their objects have more in common with the visual display of contemporary art than they do with studio glass. And yet, the meanings of the work of artists such as Swenson, Janka, and Mullings is intimately bound up in the particular qualities and processes of making glass. I call this work the product of glassy thought. For as dematerialized as it appears, it is the kind of work that could only be made by people that are paying close attention to the properties and possibilities of the material. In other words, it is not the kind of work that can be made, will be made by blue chip artists visiting the material through hiring highly skilled hands, although oftentimes these glassy thinkers are those hands. To explain, Swenson's dirt on the floor is actually an exploration of place, process, and curiosities of glassmaking. Interested in fulgurites, a natural glass formed by lightning strikes, he devised a process to simulate their formation. To accomplish this, he took raw batch, mixed it with wires and oxides, and stuck it in the microwave. The process works because glass is electronically conductive when molten, and the wire embedded in the batch caused enough arcing to melt the elements around it into these small falafel balls. To emphasize the strangeness of both the natural phenomena and his constructed one, he installed his microwave fulgurites on transparent sheets of glass ceramic and placed them within desert earth from a location that is both home to weird phenomena and to many lightning strikes. And incidentally, he suggests you don't try this at home. Stephanie Pender's Cloudy as the Stuff of Stones, which a few of you may recall from my show at Urban Glass, is a vanitas piece that uses the imperfection of materials to interlocute between worlds. She formed this work, which hovers between a full glass and other vitrified and devitrifying materials, by collecting the raw material from different places significant to her life. She then takes this collected sand, bone, and soda and melts them within plastisilica molds in her kiln. The resulting work is both earthly and, in its liminal, unstable state, earthbound, while its subject matter speaks to the hereafter. Anna Riley's project is concerned with the transmutation of colored glass into clear. She's not simply interested in decolorizing glass. The strategies for that have been known since Roman times and earlier. But rather, she's interested in removing and repurposing utility of glass. In this case, removing the dark, food-preserving color of amber beer bottles and making a clear lens, which hopefully you could have seen in the last image. A form which has perhaps contributed more to our understanding of the natural world than any other. Hers is an investigation of materials in light of an increasingly immaterial world. As she mentions in her artist statement, it is easy to forget that the digital age is part of the material age, and that our lives are deeply influenced by technologies and environments which are founded in material knowledge. My work, she says, attempts to unpack these issues through experimentation and reenactment, asking questions about the trajectory of contemporary materials, and I would say about contemporary life in relation to those materials. Incorporating aspects of Riley's experiments and Pender's Cloudy as the Stuff of Stones, Corinna Mullings' Transcendence uses bespoke glass and not quite glass, I think the Corning scientists might call that ceramic, displayed on a steel table and punctuated by, so this piece is displayed on a steel table and punctuated by cylinders of true glass, like the turquoise one you can see in the middle. Her rocky, pitted, not quite vitrified turquoise forms become a landscape of alien minerals. The excitement of visually traversing them, of encountering the clarity of the true glass amongst all the others, reminds me of a story I once heard about the Buddha. Talking to his acolytes, the Buddha once said, "The moment of transcendence is the moment when flour turns into bread." And it is that moment that Mullings' work recalls in glass. Not all of the work in this vein is in service of purely sculptural pursuits. For Johanna Janka, the Danish design atelier Garda Yankee, developing a palette of glasses derived from regionally available elements is part of building the relationship between place, object, and hand. Her piece, Collection 49, records the results of 49 experimental batch recipes in small crucibles that are laid out with all the orthogonal beauty of a spread in saveur or food and wine. A feast of greens, the glass in each crucible is derived from the mineral residue of soils collected across Europe. Despite the effort and attention given to collecting and melting these raw materials, the crucibles are only a means to the end. The real finished work is a series of drinking glasses. As she describes on the Atelier's website, these materials are giving us a recognition and understanding of nature and reference to history, where we come from to where we are now. We work with nuances and subtleties from nature, and this method forms the foundation of our aesthetics. As the work of Garda Yankee beautifully illustrates, common throughout much of this work is an attention and interest in terroir, the particular flavor and place and time that gives wine, for instance, its particular character. Terroir is not something often associated with glass, since even before the Roman era, glass was made centrally and exported widely, and the move to more locally produced formula is notable, interesting, and overdue. Why now? These products of glassy thought beg the question, why now? And even, why pay attention to the work of recent graduates, as many of these artists are, whose work is still struggling to find a satisfying form? The answer, or partial answer, is that this is metamorphic work. It offers some of the first glimpses into what will emerge as studio glass continues to shed its isolationist cocoon and works on figuring out just what kind of wings and capabilities it needs for the next phase of its development. Focusing on the transcendental moment when glass batch coalesces from a collection of dry opaque powders into a homogenized vitreous state, as Corinna Mullings does, these glassy thinkers are not only transforming the material, they are transforming the field of contemporary glass as a whole, deploying the concerns and knowledge of glass craftsmen and women in the language of contemporary art. Put another way, this work, made by artists that are equally conversant in contemporary art and the techniques and processes of glassworking, is what happens when glass becomes a suitable material for artists to manipulate. It could be said that the work that I've shown you is stronger conceptually than it is formally. And if you're thinking that, you might be shuddering that I'm saying that this is where the future is. It's okay. If that's you, I have two things to say. One, this is only one avenue of contemporary glass production. There are several other young folks out there making work that is interesting, innovative, and more closely connected with the world of objects. For instance, Courtney Dodd, whose pieces play with reflection and perception, and again, whose work we do not have. Or Thaddeus Wolf, who is in the audience, who is this year's Raycott Commission recipient, and whose piece, Stacked Grid Structure, is the first that I added to the museum's collection. This is a two-parter. Part one, the provisional appearance of the glassy thought I've shown you so far is in line with developments in other traditional materials, such as ceramics, fiber, and jewelry, which have embraced de-skilling and sloppy craft and challenged the inherent preciousness of materials in order to invest their work with alternate meanings. Part two, though this work is certainly a far cry from the incredible dexterity and command of form of mainstream, not this work, the other work, mainstream studio glass artists such as Lino Tagliapietra or Dante Marioni, it actually represents a return to the generative moment at the beginning of studio glass, where artists were first coming to terms with a material that had been, for so long, the realm of specialized knowledge sets governed by tradition, craft hierarchies, and corporate IP. In Swenson's Dirt Pile, Pender's Cloudy Bones, and Riley's Reckoning with Broken Bottles, I see echoes of experimental works by the like of Dick Marquis and Harvey Littleton, and lesser-known artists such as Patricia Esch and Nancy Freeman. These wonky and misformed pieces, which if made today would never find their way into a museum, are the technical and intellectual underpinning which later allowed artists like Tagliapietra and Marioni to reach such great heights. And it's a good thing these pieces were collected. In fact, by me just a few months ago. They are incredible artifacts of knowledge in the process of being made. And not only that, but the seeming de-skilling of glassy thinkers' hands is actually a re-skilling of their minds, as artists like Raleigh and Yankee work to reacquire a knowledge of the chemistry of glass. Glass chemistry was, in the earliest days of studio glass, an essential part of many studio glass makers' practice, because there was no suitable raw materials available for artists to purchase. Littleton and Labino, Marquis and Laughlin, Lipovsky were all working to convince a glass designed for other purposes, whether to be drawn out for thousands of yards to make fiberglass insulation material, or to freeze up quickly when machine blown into a mold, to work in the fickle setup of an artist's studio. It was not until Mark Peiser and others gathered a knowledge of the chemistry of glass and could produce a palette of colored and clear glasses that expanded and contracted at the same rate that studio glass artists could begin to fully invest their surfaces and forms with content and character. However, making glass, as evidenced by the work I've shown you, is difficult, time-consuming, laborious. And so, when Spruce Pine Batch was founded by Harvey Littleton in the mid-'80s to provide raw material for the artistic industry, many artists abandoned making glass themselves. A similar thing happened when commercial companies began to sell glass equipment around the same time. Soon, glass returned to being a received material, one which artists purchased and manipulated into shape rather than one which they understood on a fundamental level and constructed to their own desires. The turn to glass as a received material became increasingly so, as community glass centers such as Urban Glass in Brooklyn, the Studio at Corning, and others across the country overtook the studio glass mantra of one artist, one studio. Though there are many benefits to working collectively, sharing resources being only one of them, this phenomena is part of the reason that so many of my curatorial colleagues struggle to be able to see contemporary glass. Walking down the halls of the SOFA Chicago show, for instance, you see row after row of works made with the same base glass, colored with the same purchased colors. They blur together in the mind. They're all narrating the possibilities of glass and glassmaking rather than demonstrating them. That's a bit of a digression, but I hope you follow my point. The Glassy Thinkers are interesting, critical, because they are working to harness the means of production. They are inquiring of the material, returning to zero, obliterating what is known or what we think we know in order to begin again and differently. I'm very keen to see what they come up with. Oh, I think I was supposed to do that a while ago. Maybe not. Technique in glass, so here we go. Boro boys. Now this is what you've been waiting for. Technique in glass might not be the primary focus of Glassy Thinkers, but it is far from dead. In fact, it has found a prime efflorescence in the very capable hands of the Boro boys and women. Before getting further into this, a brief discussion of terms. The Boro stands for borosilicate, the low expansion, heat-resistant glass often referred to by the brand name first associated with it, Pyrex. And the boys is because for the first several decades of the phenomena I'm about to describe, it was male practitioners that got all the attention. And though several female artists have made inroads, it remains a very male-dominated area. And finally, what they are making is marijuana pipes. But so many areas of this production, there are so many areas of this production that would be of interest to a crowd interested in design history and material culture. And I might be able to do little more here than offer a primer and hint at the possibilities of the research that lies ahead. But here are the critical pieces of information you need to know to get up to speed on this topic. 1, there's an entire world of glass marijuana pipes and pipe makers that operates outside of traditional gallery systems and, for the most part, outside of the realm of mainstream studio glass. They're a big deal, and not only because pipes regularly sell in the high five figures, and not only because pipe makers are celebrities that get flown around the world to do autograph appearances, but rather, this is important because this is handmade glasswork, primarily sold through the internet to an ever-widening audience that prizes these objects for, amongst other things, the way the ornament enhances functionality. 2, it is an American phenomenon. Let's see what I have. Oh, sorry. It is an American phenomenon. No, look at that. That's good. This will give you a sense. That, like studio glass, had been gaining steam for some time, but really gained momentum through the educational efforts of a pioneering individual, in this case, Bob Snodgrass. There you can see him with one of his dragon pipes. In the early 1990s, he stopped traveling with the Grateful Dead, settled in Eugene, Oregon, pipe making's Toledo, Ohio, and began offering classes. Snodgrass, who had previously made his living selling pipes at Grateful Dead shows, had recently discovered fuming, a process whereby a small amount of precious metal is vaporized in a nearly invisible layer onto the pipe's interior. When used, and what you see here are used pieces, dark resin from the smoke is deposited inside, making visible the pinks, blues, and purples of the vaporized metals. The color change pipe, as it was called, which transformed as if in collaboration with its user, was an instant success and led to an increased demand both for the pipes themselves as well as for the hand skills to produce them. Would-be lampworkers flocked to Snodgrass's classes in Eugene and then fanned out across the country, spreading this new object type across college and, dare I say, high school campuses. The seeds of desire they planted were perfectly timed to germinate and bloom with the burgeoning use of the internet in the late 90s and early aughts. And it was the sale of pipes over the internet that got glass pipe making its first major run-in with the law. The story's too long to tell here, but suffice it to say, our government put the kibosh on this American art form so completely and for so long that it created a low-end market of Chinese and Indian pipes, knockoffs, that are what you see on the internet and in bodegas across the city and street vendor stalls on West 8th near NYU. And it spurred American makers, once they could come out of the shadows a little more, into focusing on the high-end market, which you'll see in the coming images. 3. The aesthetics are questionable. Much of the aesthetics of high-end pipes is drawn from pop culture, and in particular, the pop culture embraced by teenage boys, the image a couple ago of that rhino type pipe, who sit in their basements taking bong hits and playing video games. I'm glad they found something that they're interested in, but it isn't so much for me. In an attempt to bridge audiences, there have been efforts on the part of studio glass flame workers such as Paul Stankard and Robert Mickelson to introduce a fine art aesthetic or a fine glass aesthetic into pipe making. Most of these efforts have fallen flat. The decorative strategies of one world feel uncomfortable in another, but some are downright offensive, like this one. To me, the very worst are pipes which, in an effort to speak more broadly, commit the cardinal sins of American studio glass, which is, for the most part, a very pale endeavor. These sins are the appropriation of African faces, bodies, and motifs as decorative ornament, which I've not shown you because I don't think they should be seen. And the co-optation of Hindu and Buddhist concepts in service of some kind of transcendental language of ornament, and to say nothing of the over-sexualization and objectification of the female body, which many of these pipes display. And yet, despite works which succumb to these pitfalls, there is still much of it that is of interest, especially as it defines the aesthetic borders of a particular genre of cultural activities. Artists, for instance, like Yushin Goins, whose complex patterns are a perfect elaboration of West Coast hippie aesthetics, and Jag, just another glassblower, whose pop art mentality and emphasis on branding seem emblematic of the business savvy of the Instagram age. The works are also notable for their technical innovation. One reason Snodgrass had to fume his clear creations was that colored glass in borosilicate almost didn't exist in the mid-90s. Today, there are several companies solely devoted to colored Boro products, with new colors added on a regular basis. Pipe makers, flush with cash, have also been able to innovate equipment, pushing the envelope of size in this high-temperature, difficult-to-melt material to new heights. Perhaps you can see where I'm going. The pipe makers, questionable aesthetics and activities aside, are working with glass in exceptional ways that are pushing the limits of our knowledge of material. In so doing, they're opening new pathways for the material that never existed before. They are, like the Glassy Thinkers and the early studio glass makers before them, creating knowledge through making. There's another aspect to the pipe making world that I find equally fascinating and instructive. That is the realm of pipe collecting. Because just as there have been dedicated collectors nurturing and promoting studio glass, so there are dedicated, and some might say evangelical, pipe collectors, as committed to pipe making being accepted as art as the studio glass collectors before them. They are a remarkable case study. They really are. Because for so many reasons. In fact, let me go off script for a second and tell you some of them. people will go out of their way to collect these pieces. I've already told you that they sometimes go for incredible high amounts, huge dollar amounts. But there are also, I hear, 100K clubs where collectors will get, and this was years ago, so perhaps it's 200 or 300K clubs now, bring $100,000 worth of glass together and will sample the functionality of each other's pieces. It takes an Art Alliance visit to a new level. So it's phenomenal. And a lot of the language they use is the exact same as the language around early days of studio glass, both the way the collectors talk and the way the dealers talk. In fact, Doug, I know that we have talked about this before, but there is a young glass collector that is marketing his pipes as the antiques of the future. So just as the studio glass collectors felt and feel a strong sense of second-class citizenship for their chosen art form, so too do the pipe collectors and pipe artists, and perhaps even more so. In fact, the Netflix documentary devoted to the subject of pipe making had this hierarchical framework built into the title. It's called Degenerate Art. That the title itself is so unbelievably tone-deaf to its historical precedent is just one of the troubling aspects of this field. But I'm curious to see what the zealotry of this area of production will bring about for the future, especially as marijuana legalization continues to march across the country. In fact, just this afternoon, as I was thinking about this lecture, I got a New York Times update that Justin Trudeau introduced legislation in Canada to legalize marijuana whole hog. So if marijuana is legalized, I wonder, will these objects retain their high prices and their cultural cachet? Or will the bubble collapse with just a few artisans reaping the big bucks? We're well positioned to see for ourselves in the next few years. And now that you know about this field, you can be ready to watch. So, the three areas I've shown you tonight are by no means exhaustive. For instance, design is a major area that I didn't even have time to discuss, despite how ripe, generative, and absolutely on my mind it is now. And you might be thinking, even about the areas that I have talked about, what am I going to do? What is the museum going to do to collect in these areas? The short answer is, I'm working it out right now. I wish I could just leave it that. The long answer is, the museum has always been on the vanguard of collecting contemporary glass, and it's my intention to keep it that way. We already have a phenomenal collection of work by blue-chip artists. You've seen much of what's on view in these images. And I'm actively collecting in this area with an attention to objects that investigate the materiality and phenomenology of glass and/or its history in the decorative arts and its connection to knowledge production broadly writ. For Glassy Thinkers, the work presents some challenges, especially given our current display methods at the museum. That's also a little bit of a cop-out. I'm leaving it right there. And for pipe makers, there are potentially some legal stumbling blocks around acquisition that I'm working through, though I will happily accept donations. Nevertheless, there are some ways I am already showing this material. New Glass Review, which comes out this summer. The museum's annual exhibition imprint highlighting the 100 most notable works in glass in any given year is a regular showcase for some of this work, and will be especially this year, as Micah Evans, who was the last pipe image you saw, was one of the jurors and has selected for his jurors' choice section the work of only pipe makers. Beyond that, I'm working on a method to bring representatives of all these areas of production into the museum in a way that will hopefully allow for a critical assessment of the diverse ways artists, designers, makers, and others are using glass today. Again, that's kind of a nebulous euphemism for now, but all I can say is stay tuned. To summarize and give you the three things I want you to walk away from this talk with. 1, the material is the answer. 2, chemistry is a key to the future. And 3, dedication and effort by concerted few can change the world, or at least the world of objects. Thank you very much, and please let me see you in Courtney. Anybody got questions?
Thank you very much. There must be some questions.
Yes.
This is not a question. I just wanted the audience to know that the New York Botanical Gardens is mounting a show now that's on of Dale Chihuli's work, interspersed with floral, and also for tickets for stuff that's on display during the day but will be lit at night. That should be interesting.
If you haven't seen Chihuli's Glass and Gardens, it's one of the best ways to see it. You should go out and do that. Yes.
It was a great talk. I'm wondering about Glassy Thinkers. So I know that RISD has quite kind of pioneering glass program that fosters these types of artists that work over mediums but are glassy thinkers, I think what you're talking about. I've also done some, I'm Swedish, and I've also done a little bit of research in Stockholm at the Konstfack, the Swedish, the MFA's program there. And they do, they have a art and craft program. So it's split from their fine arts program where they do some glass. But I know that that program, for example, is kind of becoming subsumed by the art program. So there is less a focus of glass. I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about what you think education is going to look like and kind of what fosters these glassy thinkers, if it's educational programs or if it's artists in MFA programs that kind of seek glass on the side.
So I think that's a great question. I'm thinking about what the pedagogy around glass education is that leads to this kind of thinking is, I think, on a lot of people's minds. I was just at VCU, Victoria Commonwealth University in Richmond, and they have an incredible craft studies program where some of this stuff happens. Courtney Dodd, whose work I showed that I think is really quite interesting, came through that program. I'm not entirely sure. Certainly a lot of the images I showed you are of RISD students, which is both because they're making this kind of work and also because I just finished teaching there for 4 years, so it's at the tip of my fingertips. But maybe an answer to that is also my own advertisement, which is that I'm teaching a class, co-teaching a class with Mark Pizer starting next week at the Penland School of Crafts, which is called the Glass Sommelier. And the idea of that is to reintroduce this idea, to challenge this idea of glass as a received material, and to help artists realize that they can mess around with glasses and make interesting things happen. That glass, in general, I think of as physics and chemistry embodied, and it's physics and chemistry you can do without having to write out formulas. So I think there's outreach, that's a little tiny piece of outreach, but the work that Jane Cook, who's the museum's chief scientist, is doing, she's teaching at Pilchuck this summer and she's regularly on the road, is one avenue into this. And I think that it is something that many people are exploring. It's one thing that you can do if you only have, for instance, a ceramic kiln and nothing else in the city, like Stephanie Pender. So in that way, it is also very much like the beginning of Studio Glass, where people were struggling for equipment or for access. So maybe that gets towards an answer. Itai.
Thank you very much for this wonderful talk. I have two questions. One, last time I visited Corning, I was told that fiber optics is the key income of the Corning company. And I was wondering if there's any effect of the rise of fiber optics on glass art making in any way, shape or form. And that's be the first question. The second question, which of course I was fascinated by the pipe making, obviously, and I was wondering, because the pipe making is art, but at the same time there's something utilitarian about it, right? And I was wondering if those glass artists that you work on start thinking also as part of their trade on producing utilitarian objects, not just pipes, but other utilitarian objects that are made in glass. Is there like something like artists designing, let's say in fashion, that you see that they design lines or they think about commodities that are more usable? And I was wondering if you see it with
General
glass
artists or just
exactly.
ones?
Gioli was one case, right? We know that he can produce things that are a bit utilitarian. But I was wondering with these people that you showed us today, the young generation, so to speak, if they already think this way.
I think so. That's a big question, so
Yeah.
there's a lot of people that I talked about, so let me just
Yeah.
parse some things out.
Yeah.
One thing that I think is really interesting about the pipe makers is that those guys are natural born branders. They make pipes, they make pendants, they have stickers, they have gear, they have everything. They have all of that. So yes, and they work with companies to produce things, they license stuff, they do all of that. Amongst other glassmakers, I think there is an increasing, I think people that have been making things in glass, students that have come through glass programs, have always wanted to make functional vessels. And that for decades, it was totally uncool to make things that were functional, because what you should be making is art.
Exactly.
But design and the artisanal world, you need walk only around the block to get a sense that that there is more of a hankering for the handmade and for handmade on a functional level. I think that with the rise of the internet, with different venues like the Architectural Digest show, there are several young artists or designers that are making utilitarian objects and having livelihood from it. But I also hear that, to get to your point, that's something that I hear every time I go to a school. And when I was in school, I studied glassmaking before I switched teams. There was a desire, even from the RISD grads, they all graduate and say, I love blowing glass, I love making things. Is it okay? And I have to tell them that it's just fine. They can do both. So anyhow, fiber optics. I think this is the part of the story where Corning Incorporated would really, especially given the topic of my talk, like me to say that we are separate entities. And so Corning's work in fiber optics has no direct connection to things that we're doing at the museum. But I bet there are people in the audience, potentially sitting next to you, that are better qualified to answer the question of whether there are folks working with fiber optics in any kind of interesting ways. I personally can't think of any right this second. Anyone else?
Yeah, I have a question. This is a really interesting and in some ways provocative talk. And what kind of response have you gotten from different audiences when you discussed this material and your thoughts about it with them, if you can share?
Well, there are folks in the audience that I am very interested in what their reaction is. I think people have been interested. I think I think I am very lucky. No, I know that I'm very lucky to be in the place that I am at the time that I am. I think that this working on trying to figure out what the future will be means that there's an opening. And so I hope that the idea that I'm suggesting anything is somewhat comforting. But certainly pipes are something that folks have been within glass have been really nervous about for now at this point decades. So I guess I think enough already. I don't know. We'll find out, Catherine. And I'll keep.
Well, it seems to me that part of when I was hearing your talk, there's a lot of dialogue that you're doing, right? With makers, with collectors, potentially with other curators, right? With students, with teachers. So it seems to me that, these are not things that you are thinking about only in isolation, right? You're thinking about them in relationship to these other groups who have a stake in this conversation.
Yes, I will say that this kind of platform is largely, I think, what got me hired. So if that's some kind of reaction, maybe there's that. But I think one thing that I think about with this is that I am talking a lot about the development of studio glass collecting, and I am talking about it in a sort of historicizing way, which I think can be very uncomfortable. But I will take this opportunity to say that it is with like the most love and the most excitement, and actually an interest of mine is to bring more interpretation into our galleries about the studio glass movement, not just about the artists, which is what we focus on right now, but also about the role of visionary dealers and visionary collectors in building up this amazing body of work that we especially have and are the best place, best situated to show that work and to tell those stories. So, so I guess that would be my answer. Yes.
Are these fantastic pipes and fantastically expensive pipes on display, exhibited in museums or galleries or what?
Yes. I mean, short answer is the best place to see them is on your phone on Instagram. Longer answer is I got a text on my way here from a dealer that there's going to be some show on the Lower East Side. It opens on Saturday. I don't know the details.
Chesterfield.
Yes, it's Chesterfield. There you go. There have been some museum shows. The Museum of Glass in Tacoma did a show a couple of years ago.
There's one right now at the National Liberty Museum.
Great. There's one at the National Liberty Museum in Philadelphia.
Through May 7th.
You can go there and collect all. Yes.
My favorite pipe story is the one where Micah created a wonderful replica of a sewing machine, which he sold to
Major
a
collector.
major collector of mainly crafts in general. And he took her to dinner, and he had to tell her that it was really a pipe.
She turned around and said, "Oh, it's not the first one in my collection. I have."
It was
Yes.
about $40,000.
Yes.
It strikes me that some of the contemporary pipes are incredibly elaborate, and I have a hard time envisioning how someone would actually smoke them. Is that the point, or are they showpieces with the idea that you could smoke them in theory?
So this is a question that I think about a lot, especially some of them, the design doesn't seem particularly user-friendly, and I would think that as you continue to use the piece, you might want it to be more and more user-friendly. Like you don't want to have to think about how to put this down once you have used it. But in my conversations with collectors, everyone comes down on different sides. So there are some collectors that buy them as objects and don't use them, and think that that is as they should be. It should only be that way. And there are others who feel like, no, absolutely, this is a functional object, and it isn't activated until it is used. Part of that divide can come down to the legality of pipes, which is a patchwork and varies state to state and really comes down to the interpretation on any given day. But generally, pipe makers talk about it the same way that the NRA talks about it, which is that it's pipes don't smoke drugs, people smoke drugs. And so it only becomes illegal once used. So if you don't want your work to be, your collection to be illegal, then you don't use it. Another thing that I hear from pipe makers and their proponents about these elaborate pipes is that they are so elaborate in part because they are now an object which you don't have to hide under the bed. They are trying to make objects which you can display on your mantelpiece. And there are some pieces, some works that I haven't shown you, but for instance, one that's particularly appropriate for the Passover week takes the form of an Orthodox Hasid, and his hat comes off, and underneath his hat you can see that it's functional, but with his hat on you can't tell. So there's an amazing language of objects. Uh-oh, you guys have to arm wrestle.
When is the museum's pipe shop opening?
I'm not sure, but I've heard some support from our trustees. Gotcha.
There are,
Wait, someone back there.
well, there are a number of women who are also women artists who are making pipes, like Carmen Lazar.
Yes,
for one.
and Becky Feather, and
Yeah.
yes, and plenty of them. But there's still a subset, and well,
But they're up and coming.
they're up and coming. There are a number of them. Katja and Benji.
I just am wondering, overall, first of all, it's such a pleasure to hear you speak. Thank you so much. And second of all, do you see parallels? Like after listening to the talk, and we sadly missed the very beginning of it, but that I see some parallels, or I'm wondering whether you're thinking about socio-political parallels between the studio glass movement and the pipers. And that's one question. And in some ways, of course, there I think are also cultural parallels between the blue chip artists and the glassy thinkers. So I think that there's two streams really ultimately in my mind from taking from your lecture. And I would like to hear your comments today or over time on that.
Let's go over time, Katja. Yes, but yes, I am thinking exactly like that. I do have to say that my pipe article, which was in Glass Magazine, originally was meant to take that framework, but did not in the end. So yes, I've been thinking about that for some time.
And I just wanted to say that to the chemistry matters and to the comment of the Swedish woman in the front, I just was thinking afterwards that, you know, there are, I think, places in the world where the two fields of the kind of glass chemistry and the glass making paralleled each other or coexisted possibly uncomfortably, and that those might be great resources for some people to know about because they, I don't think, are widely known. So just as an example, the Czech secondary school system had in fact two separate branches in the glass education field. One of them was for the people on the artist track, and one of them was for the people on the technical chemical track. And those people that were on the technical chemical track, you know, I don't think any of them have been actually brought, for example, to the United States ever to talk, while the people from the other camp have been brought here quite widely.
Interesting.
It's something to consider.
That's fascinating. I love it. Thank you.
Hi, Susie.
I wanted to ask, so of the three sort of areas that you were talking about, what I thought was so interesting about your talk was you were describing not only three sort of different areas of study, but also three different economic models, which to me was super fascinating because they also represented, I thought, really different barriers to entry. You know, it seems to me like in terms of paying for materials and equipment, it's probably much easier to start out as a pipe maker than it is to hire a Venetian studio to execute your work. So, you know, the blue chip artist, that made sense to me, and the pipe maker's economic model of direct sales to consumer, that's also probably pretty straightforward. But what I was really curious to hear your opinion on is how are the conceptual artists, the Glassy Thinkers, like where are they finding support and who's, you know, how is the sausage being made in terms of advancing their, you know, sort of inaccessible, you know, difficult to collect, not able to put on your mantelpiece type of work?
Jean, I love that question because you know how much I love thinking about the market. I think the Glassy Thinkers work is really interesting because that is work that's being nurtured outside of gallery system primarily because in part we're in this generational shift, and it's work that is being made through artist residencies, like artist residency as income in large part. So that's one whole stream, and the other is as hired hands for the blue chip artists. So they do that during the day, and then they go home and make this other stuff at night. So it's again, I think it is a perfect kind of intermediary, and the reason why that's not probably a very sustainable or satisfying long-term solution. So I think it will be very interesting to see what happens. Yeah, good. Well, guys, I think we're at time, and I don't like to go over. I'm here.